It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the RCA Evolution Premium. The OSD is controlled by a joystick at the rear towards the right side. If you press that left, you can activate the Game Plus features, and I'll go through them when I get to them in the main menu. Move the joystick to the right and you can activate the presets. Again, I'll go through them when I get to them in the main menu. Up allows you to select the input used by the monitor. And if you press down without entering the main menu, you can select the USB upstream used. So this is for the KVM functionality. If you want to turn the monitor off, then you hold the joystick in for a few seconds. If you just press it in, then you get to the main menu. So as it says there, you can use the joystick to move, go back, or enter, depending on the direction you're using. So if I want to go deeper into the display part of the menu, I would press right. And for sliders, it's quite clear what it's doing. But if I go on something which has a selection instead, so preset for example, it doesn't actually show you what preset is selected, which I find a little bit awkward. If you go back, it does actually say user, so it shows you what all of these values are set to, and that's quite nice. But it really should highlight it there as well when you're in this part of the menu, just to make it clearer. Although if you go further in, so I press right again, it then will go to whatever was selected, so user in my case. Before going through the main menu, I want to address the question, what are the best settings for this monitor? By best settings, I mean the settings which I use as my test settings, so they suit my unit, my lighting conditions, my preferences, and the targets I go for when I review monitors. They keep my colorimeter happy, in other words, but individual preferences and units will vary. So first off, brightness, I changed that to 42. That got around 160 nits, which is a target I usually go for consistency when I'm reviewing, and that suits most of my lighting conditions in my room. The preset user is my preferred setting. That's because all of the others, well, they make various changes to the image, but they also block off a lot of things. Even the brightness control makes them essentially quite useless for most people. Hue and saturation is also blocked off, which is less important, but strangely you can adjust the color channels, so it's a bit odd how they've restricted things like brightness, but you can change the color channels in all of the presets. Anyway, just stick to user, it's the most flexible. Color temperature was another change I made. It was actually set to user by default. Normal on my unit was a bit cool tinted, so I had to go to user and reduce the green channel and also the blue channel. But again, this is just for my units, my preferences, my targets, etc. These aren't necessarily going to be optimal in your case. And I left everything else alone, except I made sure that FreeSync/G-Sync was set to on. This controls adaptive sync on the monitor, so you can use FreeSync or G-Sync compatible. And the overdrive I like to set to middle, at least for higher refresh rates, and this is explored more in the review. And that's really all I changed. So user preset, lowered the brightness to 42, made some adjustments to color channels, enabled FreeSync/G-Sync, and made sure overdrive was set to middle. I've enabled HDR, and when you do this, you'll notice that the settings are very different. Most things are grayed out, and you can't change the preset. All you can actually change is the sharpness. Color's also grayed out. So you can set the overdrive, you can enable FreeSync/G-Sync, so you can use VRR at the same time as HDR. So yeah, it's really very restrictive, and the neutral value of 50 for sharpness I find just fine, but if you want to change according to your preferences, you can do that. 60 actually gives quite a strong over-sharpening. It's quite a strong sharpness algorithm, if that makes sense. So just one nudge up to 60 really does give obvious over-sharpening, quite an artificial look. I mean, I like to see sharpness control because not all monitors have it, but I think it would have been better to have a more granular approach to the sharpness control as well. So back to the remaining settings under SDR now. So I've got legom.nl, the website, open in the tests for black levels there, just to give you an idea of what the black equalize setting does. The room's kind of bright, but it doesn't really matter for this demonstration. You won't be able to see exactly what you would see to the eye anyway. I'm just going to change the OSD position so you can actually see the blocks as well at the top. Remember that what you see is not what you'd see to the eye, but it'll give you a rough idea of what the setting does. So you increase it, and it does flood the image. If you increase it a lot, it does affect your contrast as you increase it beyond 50, which is the neutral point. And actually it raises up a lot of other shades as well. So it's not very selective. It's not great in that respect, but it does give you a competitive edge if that's what you want. I personally prefer settings like this when they just target the darker shades other than black. They don't affect the contrast and they don't do much to the brighter or medium to bright shades. But it does give you a competitive edge if that's what you're looking for and you want to increase this. And it is a slider from 0 to 100, with 50 being the default. If you decrease it below 50, then it starts crushing things together, if you want that kind of look. The sharpness control, I would also mention that if you want to use the monitor in a non-native resolution, so using interpolation, you're running the monitor full HD, for example, well, the interpolation on this monitor, the scaling, it will only work up to 120 Hz. And also it gives moderate softening to the image. And then if you increase sharpness to 60, then it's obviously over-sharpened and it just looks artificial and weird. So it's not exactly a great monitor for running at non-native resolutions. I'd actually recommend using GPU scaling if that's an option. If you're a PC user, that will be an option. It also means you can run it at 240 Hz full HD, but you're not actually changing what the monitor's doing. The monitor's just going to output in its native QHD resolution, and then the GPU will handle the scaling. Sometimes monitor scaling works a bit better than that, but GPU scaling is decent, to be honest, and it works better than the monitor's interpolation in this instance. So the aspect ratio setting, that is grayed out when you're running the native resolution. So I've just switched over to full HD 120 Hz, and you can see the monitor is reporting that, so it is using its own scaling. And aspect ratio still grayed out, could be because I've got FreeSync/G-Sync enabled. And now the settings available, you can see there's full, which will fill up all of the pixels of the screen. We'll use them all and stretch the image potentially if it's not a 16:9 aspect ratio. The 16:9, which will enforce a 16:9 aspect ratio. And for this resolution, that doesn't make a difference, 16:9 anyway. And there's 4:3, which will enforce a 4:3 aspect ratio. You can see black bars there, and it's all squashed up, but that's because it's a 16:9 resolution. But if it's actually a 5:4 aspect ratio for the source resolution, then this would make more sense. So as you can see, there isn't a one-to-one pixel mapping mode, which would give you an undistorted full HD, for example, but you can do that with GPU scaling anyway, if you're a PC user. And I've got the screen running at the native resolution and 240 Hz, just to show you that the aspect ratio setting is available, as long as you're not using adaptive sync, so you don't have FreeSync/G-Sync enabled. Moving on to the color section. So there's color temperature, set to user by default with everything set to 100. I went through that before. Normal. On my unit, normal gets rid of a bit of a green tint that it has by default. Default being used with everything set to 100, remember, but it's still far too cool tinted. Cool gives a higher white point, so a very cool tint. Warm gives a somewhat lower white point, but it's still about 7000 K on my unit, so it isn't exactly warm by any stretch of the imagination. It's actually cooler than the standard 6500 K target. sRGB, kind of similar to normal, really. It isn't an sRGB emulation setting, so don't get too excited, although it doesn't lock anything off either. So it's just really an alternative color temperature setting. But again, my preference, user, and then you can make your own adjustments there. Gamma, off 1.8, 2.0, 2.2, 2.4. Off and 2.2 were pretty similar on my unit. The gamma doesn't necessarily correspond to what it shows here. It didn't exactly on my unit, but it just is a way of allowing you to increase or decrease the gamma. You've got a hue control set to 50 by default. If you want to skew the image in the usual way with a hue control, you can do that. Saturation slider set to 50 by default. This is a digital saturation enhancement if you increase it beyond 50. So it starts pulling shades closer to the edge of the gamut. So you lose shade variety without the most saturated shades becoming any more saturated. So some people like this when they're gaming competitively. It can sort of crush things together, give a simpler look. Sometimes they find it sort of less distracting visually, I guess. If you decrease it below 50, then it starts to desaturate the image. It's very difficult to get the balance right. I always say this with saturation sliders, even if it has finer control than this. And that is to say that you'll find that some shades will become quite undersaturated whilst others remain quite strongly saturated, so it can be difficult to get the balance right. So then you might want to make those highly saturated shades even less saturated, so you'll drag this down further, and then some of the shades look really greyish and muted. But just according to your own preferences, you may like to decrease this a little bit because it's a wide gamut monitor and doesn't have an sRGB emulation setting. Low blue light, increasing this to 25, that's one step up, 50, 75, 100. It is an effective low blue light setting, especially at higher settings such as 100. It also introduces a very obvious greenish yellow tint, which is not something that my eyes adjust to. Everyone's different, but generally people will struggle to adjust to this because it's a very strong setting. If you set it only to 25 or 50, perhaps you'll adjust to some extent, but I prefer low blue light settings, which are visually better balanced, and they will decrease the green channel a bit as well. There's FreeSync/G-Sync, which I went through. That's an adaptive sync toggle. Overdrive, which I went through and certainly explored in the review. Game Plus, so there are a few different settings here. There's an on-screen timer. You can set that to various different values there in seconds, and that appears at the top left there, so it's just counting down from 90 minutes, sorry, not seconds, 90 minutes. There's a crosshair. A few different designs here, green and red, a dot, a cross, and another design. So the dot looks quite big there on the menu, but it's actually tiny in real life, or when it's actually on the screen. Just changed the wallpaper so you can just about see it right in the middle there. As I said, really tiny, and you can't use the timer at the same time as a crosshair, by the way, so these Game Plus features, you can only use one at the same time. And you can't move the crosshair, you can't customize the design, it's just the design shown and the colors shown. So just to show you what the cross looks like, it's a bit clearer than the dot, just a little cross in the middle there. And for good measure, I'll show you the final design. That is quite a bit larger. So yes, the representations that they show you in the menu are not really very good. There's also an FPS counter, and this is at the top right. So it says 240 at the moment, 240 Hertz. I'll just quickly open G-Sync Pendulum demo, but because I don't have Adaptive Sync active in the OSD, it's not using VRR, stays at a static 240 Hertz. I've enabled VRR, but I'm going to have to open the demo again so it can activate G-Sync properly. And now you can see it fluctuating all over the place as the frame rate is changing. You'll also note that the bar there says FPS. That doesn't change in real time, but it does change so that it represents the frame rate of the content. Well, actually, it's the refresh rate the monitor's running at, which can change under VRR in accordance with the frame rate at the moment when you enter the main menu system. So just to quickly demonstrate that, I've got G-Sync open again, the pendulum demo, 240, because that's what it was when I was first opening the menu. So if I close it and then go back, you see it now says 94 FPS. There's DCR, dynamic contrast ratio. That's the dynamic contrast feature of the monitor. Allows the backlight to change according to the amount of brightness or darkness on the screen. The backlight's just shifting as one unit. There's no local dimming here, so it's a compromise as usual for dynamic contrast settings. And you can't change the brightness according to your own preferences. It just does its own thing. So very restrictive, but it does dim and brighten at a moderate pace according to the level of bright and dark on the screen, as you would expect from a dynamic contrast setting. Although I have to say that even when there's a lot of darkness on the screen, it's quite shy about dimming, so it doesn't seem to dim an awful lot, but it does brighten up for brighter to medium content quite well. Anyway, it's just a standard dynamic contrast setting. There's MPRT, and that is the strobe backlight setting. It is grayed out unless you have FreeSync/G-Sync disabled, so you can't use it at the same time as VRR. I'm just going to enable this so it's just on or off. You might notice some flickering on the screen. It's not usually too bad. My camera filters it out quite well, but just in case, just note that there might be flickering. It looks like you can change the brightness, but if you do this, it actually disables MPRT straight away. And it doesn't matter what you set this to before setting the setting. It will always go to the same brightness level, regardless of what it shows there. It just has its own preset level, which it'll go to. If you make changes to the color channels, MPRT remains active. So you can change the color channels, and I believe you can change anything else actually. Yeah, the gamma, it's just the brightness you can't change with MPRT active. And as covered in the review, it's around 100 nits with MPRT active, so it's fairly dim to be honest. Next you've got advanced. HDR can be set to off if you never want to use HDR, or auto, which means that when an HDR signal is received, then the monitor will switch to its HDR mode. RGB Light, quite a simple RGB lighting feature. So simple that I actually sometimes leave this on without realizing. It isn't really something you can appreciate at all from the front. It's not particularly bright, but it's just at the rear. There's a little strip there, and the same at the other side. And it just cycles through various different colors. You can't customize it in any way. It just is or isn't if you have it disabled. So very simple. And there's KVM, and that is the same as the options you get with the quick menu, which I showed you before. So something to note here is this is just allowing you to select the USB input used, what's going to be used for the upstream data of the monitor. So note this is manual KVM activation. So it says USB off, USB up, which is a Type B port, or Type C. So if I selected Type C here, except I'm using my system with DisplayPort and let's say the USB B ports being used, so USB up, I would have to select KVM USB up as well as the display signal set to DisplayPort. In other words, it's basically a two-step process. It is quite easy to do with the joystick at least. So if you press the joystick up without going into the main menu, remember you can select the input easily or have it automatically select if you trust it to do that. That's fine, that might work, but then remember you have to press down and then actually manually select the USB being used. There's no sort of automatic selection of USB or any way to assign different display inputs to different USB upstream ports. So not the most complex manual KVM activation, but I do prefer automatic. But it is better when there's a wizard or something to automatically do everything at the same time. And there's input, which is exactly the same as what I just showed you. System set, you can change the language that the OSD is displayed in. OSD setups, horizontal and vertical position. Timeout period, so how long after the last button press in seconds before it automatically disappears. Between 15 and 60 seconds. There's a transparency effect, if you want that. You can mute or change the volume of the integrated speakers, and presumably the 3.5mm headphone jack if you're using that. USB upgrade. So this should allow you to upgrade the firmware of the monitor. That isn't something which I've seen so far. In fact, there's not really a page that I could find that would list firmware on this monitor, but it's something which RCA could support in the future. So they do actually have upgradable firmware support on the monitor. It's just a case of getting any software sorted and the pages sorted for that on the website. And then there'll be a process for upgrading the firmware. And there's reset, which resets everything to the factory defaults. So that's all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the RCA Evolution Premium. Be sure to check out the full review, and there's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.